It was September 3rd, 1945. The Pacific War had ended, but the echoes of surrender still hung in the heavy, humid air over Okinawa. For months, the island had been a graveyard of smoke and silence, a scar of human desperation. Now, in the midst of ruins and twisted steel, a small convoy of military trucks rumbled down a dirt road leading toward a hastily constructed American encampment. Inside one of those trucks sat 14 Japanese women, nurses, clerks, radio operators, all captured in the final days of the war. They had been gathered from field hospitals, surrendered outposts and broken units, their uniforms tattered, their faces gaunt, and their spirits hollowed by defeat. No one spoke. The rhythmic clatter of the truck's wheels over the uneven ground was the only sound. In the far corner, a young woman named Aiko kept her hands tightly clasped together, her knuckles white. She was 23 years old and had served as a nurse in an underground medical post near Naha. For weeks, she had treated wounded soldiers with supplies that ran out long before the fighting stopped. She had seen children crushed beneath rubble, men burned alive by napalm, and women who would never stop shaking after what they had endured. She had learned to speak little and think even less, because thought brought fear, and fear was useless in war. Now she sat in silence, her eyes fixed on the floorboards. Around her, the other women sat in similar stillness. Some prayed quietly, some simply stared at nothing. Their world had ended, and they were still breathing inside its ashes. When the truck finally slowed, the air shifted. Aiko could feel it, the subtle change in energy that comes when one world collides with another. The driver shouted something in English, a sound like gravel against metal. The tailgate creaked open, and blinding sunlight poured inside. Aiko blinked hard, shielding her eyes. The first thing she saw was a sea of khaki, the uniforms of American soldiers standing in formation, rifles slung casually across broad shoulders. She had expected something different. The propaganda back home had painted them as monsters, depraved, savage men who laughed while torturing prisoners, who disrespected women, who reeked of arrogance and moral decay. The officers had told them that if they were captured, they would be violated or killed. That the Americans were weak in spirit but strong in cruelty. That surrender was worse than death, but now, standing in front of her, the reality didn't match the nightmare. The soldiers weren't sneering or shouting. They stood calmly, their posture firm but not threatening. They were young, most barely older than she was, and impossibly tall. Their skin glistened under the tropical sun, their uniforms neat and pressed, their boots spotless. They looked like something from another world, larger, brighter, almost unreal. Aiko hesitated at the edge of the truck bed, frozen by a strange mix of awe and dread. One of the soldiers motioned for her group to step down, his hand extended, not aggressively but politely. She didn't understand the words he said, but his tone was soft. She blinked at the gesture, unable to move. Finally, one of the women behind her, Yumi, nudged her forward. The two descended together, their bare feet meeting the warm dust of foreign soil. As more women stepped down, a quiet murmur spread among them. They had expected jeers, commands, maybe even blows. Instead, the soldiers simply watched, curious, almost hesitant. One of them, a towering man with sandy hair and deep-set eyes, whispered something to another soldier who laughed under his breath. Aiko didn't know why, but her heart raced at the sound. It wasn't mocking laughter. It sounded normal, human. Their interpreter, a thin sergeant from Hawaii named Nakamura, spoke to the women in careful Japanese. "You are being taken to a processing camp," he explained. "You will be questioned, then treated for medical needs. You will not be harmed." The words felt heavy in the air. None of the women believed him at first. "You will not be harmed," was a phrase that had lost meaning long ago. But the calm in his voice carried something different, something they hadn't heard in years. Aiko watched the men as they guided them into a line. Their faces were open, their expressions easy. They didn't leer or smirk. They just looked puzzled. One soldier, tall and broad, glanced at Aiko for a moment. Not in lust, but in curiosity, as though studying a fragile thing he didn't want to break. It made her chest tighten in confusion. When the line began to move, the group passed by a large tent where crates were stacked high with supplies, food, bandages, blankets, and boxes marked medical. The smell of cooked meat drifted from somewhere nearby. It made several of the women instinctively flinch. They had learned to associate strong smells with raids and destruction, but here, the scent was strangely comforting, a reminder of a world where hunger wasn't constant. Inside the main tent, the women were told to sit. An American officer entered, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a square jaw. He spoke in English, and Nakamura translated. "You are prisoners of war. You will be treated according to international law. Cooperation will ensure good treatment." The women nodded mechanically. Most didn't even know what international law meant. As the officer left, a female nurse, American, entered with a tray of tin cups filled with water. She offered them one by one. The Japanese women hesitated, staring at her. She smiled gently and said something that sounded like, "It's all right." Aiko took the cup last. Her hands trembled as she drank. The water was cold, clean, pure. It slid down her throat like something holy. She closed her eyes, feeling the burn of tears she hadn't allowed herself to shed in years. Outside, the sun dipped lower. The camp came alive with movement. Soldiers cleaning rifles, laughing, passing footballs between tents. The sound of their laughter drifted through the fabric walls, foreign and melodic. For the first time in months, Aiko heard laughter that wasn't cruel. That night, as the women lay on cots in the barracks, Yumi whispered, "They are not like what we were told." Aiko said nothing. She stared at the canvas ceiling, replaying the image of the tall soldier's face in her mind. The world had broken, and somehow this new one was even harder to understand. Days passed. The women were assigned simple tasks: laundry, kitchen work, cleaning medical stations. The Americans watched them with the uneasy curiosity one might show wild animals suddenly tamed. But over time, something shifted. The soldiers began greeting them, using simple words. "Hello? Thank you. Good morning." The women, shy but observant, tried to mimic the phrases. It became a small ritual of exchange, awkward smiles across language, gestures of mutual recognition. One morning, as the group carried laundry across the campyard, Aiko overheard two American guards talking nearby. They were laughing about something, one pointing at his boots. She didn't catch the words, but their tone was light. Yumi leaned toward her and whispered in Japanese, "They are always laughing. Maybe that is their weapon. They laugh instead of cry." That afternoon, while hanging sheets in the sun, Aiko noticed the same tall soldier from the first day, the one with sandy hair and strong shoulders. He was helping another guard unload crates. The sleeves of his shirt were rolled up, revealing arms like carved stone. Every movement looked effortless. Fumi, one of the younger women, followed Aiko's gaze and smirked. "Everything about them is big," she whispered in Japanese, barely containing her amusement. "Their hands, their boots, even their shadows." Aiko tried not to smile, but failed. That night, the remark spread quietly through the barracks like wildfire. "Everything about them is big," one woman would say, and the others would giggle softly under their breath. It wasn't mockery. It was relief disguised as humour, a way to remind themselves that they were still human enough to laugh. By the third week, the laughter had become a quiet rebellion. It wasn't loud or disrespectful. It was subtle. A shared look, a muffled giggle, a moment of warmth in a place built on cold order. The guards noticed but didn't intervene. Some even seemed amused by the strange liveliness of their prisoners. Private Raymond Cooper, barely 22 and fresh from Iowa, confided in his journal one night. "The Japanese girls don't look like soldiers. They look like schoolteachers or nurses. They laugh quietly sometimes, like they're trying to remember how. I don't think they hate us. Maybe they're just trying to survive in their own way." But not all guards were comfortable with this new dynamic. One afternoon, Sergeant Miller scolded a group of women for talking too much while folding linens. His tone was sharp, but his words were more bark than bite. The women fell silent immediately. Later, Aiko would think about the difference between the discipline of these men and the rage she had seen from her own officers. The Americans barked orders, but they didn't strike. They shouted, but not out of cruelty. It was simply structure. On the morning of October 10th, an inspection was announced. The women were lined up outside their barracks, facing a group of American officers. Aiko's heart pounded as the commanding officer approached. He stopped in front of her, studying her face for a long moment. She lowered her eyes instinctively. Then he nodded slightly, not as a conqueror but as a man acknowledging another human being. He moved on without a word. It was a small thing, but it changed something inside her. That afternoon she found herself watching the guards more closely, their camaraderie, their laughter, their gentleness. There was no hatred in them, no obsession with honour or purity, just life in its simple, unashamed form. They joked about weather, about food, about home. And when they spoke of home, their voices softened. Aiko began to wonder if the war had stolen more from her than just her country. Maybe it had stolen her understanding of humanity itself. One evening, as the sun sank behind the hills, the women gathered near the fence to watch the sky. The air smelled of dust and rain. A group of guards played a game of catch nearby, their laughter echoing through the yard. One of them threw the ball too hard. It bounced off the fence and rolled toward the women. Aiko froze as the ball stopped near her feet. The tall soldier, the one with sandy hair, jogged over to retrieve it. When he reached the fence, he stopped and smiled. Up close, his face was open and kind, his blue eyes catching the fading light. He gestured to the ball, then pointed to himself. "Ball," he said slowly. "Can I?" Aiko blinked, unsure. Then she bent down, picked up the ball and hesitated. It was warm from the sun, heavier than she expected. For a second, she imagined keeping it, just to feel something real. Then she tossed it back through the fence. He caught it easily. "Thank you," he said. The words were simple, but his tone made them feel like music. As he turned to leave, Aiko heard herself whisper in broken English, "You..." Very tall. He looked back, surprised, and then laughed. A warm, unguarded laugh that reached his eyes. He nodded and replied, "You..." Very small. For a heartbeat, the war didn't exist. It was just two people, separated by a fence, acknowledging each other's humanity through awkward words and genuine smiles. That night, when Aiko returned to the barracks, Yumi teased her relentlessly. "So now you talk to giants?" she whispered. The others giggled. Aiko hid her face in her hands, laughing too. But later, as she lay awake staring at the ceiling, she thought about that laugh. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't mocking. It was real. And for the first time since the war began, Aiko realized something terrifying and beautiful. She wasn't afraid anymore. The days in the camp began to blend together, one bleeding quietly into the next, as if time itself had lost its sharp edges. The Japanese women soon learned the rhythm of captivity: morning roll call, assigned duties, brief inspections, and long hours of waiting. Waiting for letters that never came. Waiting for news of families they feared were gone. Waiting for a war that had already ended, yet still lingered in every breath. Aiko found solace in routine. The small tasks, folding linen, sweeping floors, tending to the infirmary, gave her hands purpose, even if her mind drifted elsewhere. Sometimes she caught herself humming softly while she worked. Old songs from childhood, half-forgotten melodies her mother used to sing before the world turned to fire. The other women would glance up, startled, then smile faintly. It had been so long since anyone dared to hum. By late October, the oppressive heat had faded into a gentler warmth. The air smelled of pine and distant ocean salt. The guards had grown accustomed to their presence, no longer watching them as curiosities, but as quiet fixtures of camp life. Yet curiosity still shimmered beneath the surface, unspoken, mutual, cautious. One afternoon, as the women worked in the laundry yard, Private Raymond Cooper passed by with two other soldiers, carrying crates of supplies. He gave a polite nod as he passed, and Aiko noticed how the others responded to him with small gestures of respect. He wasn't large like the others, leaner, with soft blue eyes that seemed out of place among the rigid lines of the camp. Later, when they crossed paths again near the mess hall, he surprised her with a simple greeting. "Hello," he said slowly, pointing to himself. "Raymond." Then he gestured toward her, waiting. Aiko hesitated, unsure whether to respond. Finally, she pointed to her chest. "Aiko." Her pronunciation was quiet, uncertain, but his smile in response was gentle, approving. "Aiko," he repeated carefully, as if the name itself was fragile. Then, as if realizing the moment was delicate, he simply nodded and walked away. That night, she lay awake thinking about the way he had said her name. Not as a prisoner's number, not as a duty, but as if he wanted to remember it. In a place where identity had been stripped away, hearing her own name spoken kindly felt like a small miracle. Over the next weeks, she saw him often. Sometimes he brought boxes of rations, sometimes he was assigned to patrol near their work area. He always acknowledged her presence, not with words, but with quiet, deliberate recognition. Once, while she struggled to lift a heavy bucket of water, he stepped forward, gesturing to help. She froze, torn between pride and fatigue. He didn't insist. He simply waited until she nodded, then took the bucket from her hands. He carried it with ease, setting it down near the door, then stepped back with a slight bow, almost respectful, as if aware of the unspoken rules between them. It was such a simple act, yet it unsettled her more than any order or command ever had, because kindness, she realized, was harder to endure than cruelty. Cruelty could be met with anger or silence or numbness, but kindness demanded that she feel something, and feelings were dangerous. The others noticed. One evening, Yumi teased her with a whisper. "You talk to the tall one now? The one with the eyes like the sea?" Aiko shook her head quickly, denying it, but her flushed cheeks gave her away. "It is only work," she murmured. "He is just polite," Yumi smiled knowingly. "Politeness can be dangerous, especially when you start to like it." That night, as rain pattered softly against the canvas roof, Aiko thought about Yumi's words. She didn't like the soldier, not in the way that Yumi meant. She was certain of that. And yet, each time he looked at her, she felt something stir, something she couldn't name. Perhaps it wasn't affection at all, but the fragile memory of how it felt to be treated as human. Weeks later, that fragile thread would be tested. It began with a simple misunderstanding. One morning, the guards were distributing new blankets to replace the thin, worn ones the women had been using since arrival. The soldiers joked among themselves, tossing bundles from the truck to the prisoners. The air was filled with confusion, half-translated orders, nervous laughter, the rustle of fabric. When Raymond handed Aiko a folded blanket, she froze, misunderstanding his gesture. She thought he meant to take something from her, not give. Reflexively, she stepped back, clutching her old blanket to her chest. "No," she said in halting English, shaking her head. He frowned, trying to explain. No, new," he said, holding it out again. "For you." The other women began murmuring, unsure what was happening. One of them whispered in Japanese, "He's taking her things." Another muttered, "Maybe punishment." The tension grew until Raymond realized what they thought. He set the new blanket on the ground, stepped back and gestured for her to take it, palms open. Slowly, Aiko lowered her arms. She looked from him to the blanket, then back again. His expression was calm, patient, his blue eyes steady. Tentatively, she stepped forward and picked it up. The wool was soft, thick, far better than anything they'd had before. She looked at him, puzzled. He smiled faintly. "Warm," he said, touching his chest. "For sleep." Something inside her cracked open. She wanted to thank him, but her English failed her. Instead, she bowed slightly, her throat tightening. He mirrored the gesture clumsily, his height making it almost comical. And for the first time since her capture, she laughed, softly, involuntarily, a quiet burst of disbelief. The others, seeing her reaction, began to smile as well. Later, that moment became a running joke among the women. "We thought they'd strip us," Yumi said one night, her tone half laughing, half ashamed. "But they gave us blankets instead." The room filled with laughter, the kind that comes from exhaustion and astonishment, from the absurdity of surviving in a world that still made room for kindness. Even the guards noticed the change. The camp, once heavy with silence, began to hum with subtle life. The women moved with less fear. They greeted the soldiers, offered shy smiles, even attempted broken English. The Americans, for their part, seemed to soften too. They brought extra portions of rice, small gifts, soap, paper, pencils, nothing official, just tokens of quiet goodwill. The war between them had ended, but a smaller, quieter war remained, the battle between memory and mercy. For Aiko, that battle played out in small moments. When she watched Raymond laugh with his friends, she wondered what he saw when he looked at her. Did he see an enemy, or simply a woman trying to remember how to exist without fear? When he handed her a pencil one afternoon, for writing, he said, miming the motion, she held it like a relic, an instrument of freedom. That evening, she wrote her name on a scrap of paper for the first time since the surrender. Just her name, Aiko Sato. The letters looked strange, half-forgotten shapes that didn't feel like they belonged to her anymore. But as she traced them with her fingertip, she whispered the words softly, reminding herself that she still existed beyond the label of prisoner. In the following days, the dynamic between the women and the guards grew more complex. Some guards avoided contact altogether, uncomfortable with the softening boundaries. Others, like Raymond, leaned into the quiet exchanges, believing that decency was not weakness but healing. One afternoon, while collecting laundry near the fence, Aiko heard the sound of faint singing from across the yard. It was one of the American nurses, humming a melody unfamiliar yet strangely comforting. The tune flowed through the air like something ancient. Without realizing it, Aiko began to hum along, matching the rhythm. When the nurse noticed, she smiled and raised her voice slightly. It was the first time music had crossed that fence. The song ended with laughter, light, uncertain, but sincere. That night, as the women lay in their bunks, Yumi whispered, "They sing even after killing." How strange. Aiko didn't answer. She thought of the melody, of the sound of the nurse's voice mixing with her own. Maybe that was what made humans survive, the ability to still create beauty in the ruins. By November, the Americans had started preparing the camp for long-term use. Rumours spread that some prisoners would soon be transferred to Hawaii, others to the mainland for interrogation. The uncertainty hung over everyone like fog. The women grew restless. Some feared being sent back to Japan, others secretly hoped for it. But for Aiko, the thought of leaving filled her with a quiet ache she couldn't explain. One afternoon, she was called to the medical tent for a routine examination. Raymond was on duty nearby. When she stepped inside, the air smelled of antiseptic and soap. The American doctor, an older man with a kind face, spoke gently through an interpreter. When the examination ended, he gestured for her to sit. "You're underweight," he said. "You need rest." Then, surprisingly, he offered her a small tin of condensed milk. "A gift," he said. Aiko accepted it with trembling hands. "Thank you," she whispered. As she stepped outside, Raymond was waiting by the entrance. He noticed the tin in her hands and smiled. "Sweet," he said, tapping his chest. "For you," she nodded, then hesitated. She wanted to offer something back, but had nothing. Finally, she reached into her sleeve and pulled out a tiny origami crane she'd folded from scrap paper. She held it out to him. "For you," she said softly. He took it as if it were made of glass. "Beautiful," he murmured, turning it gently between his fingers. Their eyes met for a moment that felt suspended in time. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The gesture said what words could not, that gratitude and compassion could exist even between former enemies. Later that evening, when she returned to the barracks, she noticed something strange. The guards on patrol had stopped carrying their rifles at the ready. Some walked with them slung casually over their shoulders, others left them leaning by the gates. The tension that had once defined every interaction had dissolved into something more human, though neither side could name it. Yet beneath this fragile peace, guilt and shame still pulsed like an undercurrent. For the women, it was the guilt of survival. For the men, it was the shame of what war had demanded of them. They were all trying in their own ways to atone for something too vast to comprehend. One night, as the camp settled into silence, Aiko sat outside, wrapped in her new blanket. The moon was full, silvering the fence with light. Raymond approached quietly, his boots crunching softly on gravel. He stopped a few feet away, careful to keep the distance between them. "Cold?" he asked. She shook her head, then looked up at him. "You—" "Always kind," she said, her accent heavy but clear. He smiled faintly. "Not kind, just—" Human. She repeated the word softly. Human. Then, after a pause, we forget that. He nodded. So did we. They stood in silence for a long time, two silhouettes divided by wire, but united by something deeper. Recognition. When he finally turned to leave, Aiko whispered, "Raymond." He stopped, looking back. She pointed to herself, smiling shyly. "Aiko," he nodded once. "I know." That night, as she lay in her bunk, listening to the rhythmic chorus of crickets beyond the tent, she felt something she hadn't felt in years. Peace. Not happiness, not freedom, but peace. The kind that comes when fear no longer owns you. The following morning, she woke to find the camp bathed in golden light. Birds circled above the wire, and the air smelled faintly of rain. As she stepped outside, she saw Raymond in the distance talking to another guard. For a moment their eyes met across the yard, and he raised a hand in greeting. She hesitated, then did the same. The war had made monsters out of nations. But here, in this forgotten corner of its aftermath, two people had found a way to remember what it meant to be human. By December, the nights had turned cold in the camp. The humidity that once clung to every surface was gone, replaced by crisp air that smelled faintly of wood smoke and rain. The American soldiers built small fires near the barracks after dusk, their laughter drifting through the stillness like faint music. The Japanese women, wrapped in their heavy wool blankets, listened in silence. The sound of that laughter was strange, not cruel, not mocking. It was the laughter of men who were alive. Inside the women's quarters, the atmosphere had changed as well. The fear that once filled every corner had softened into something unfamiliar. Calm. The women talked more now, sometimes even smiled. They shared fragments of memories from before the war, childhood games, school songs, stories about parents they might never see again. And sometimes, when they were brave enough, they spoke of the Americans. Fumi, the youngest, often made the others laugh with her exaggerations. "Did you see the one today with arms like tree trunks?" she whispered once, giggling. "If I stood next to him, I'd look like a child." Yumi shook her head, pretending to scold her. "You sound like you're describing gods, not men." Fumi grinned. "Maybe they are gods, big, loud, and always smiling." The room filled with quiet laughter, the kind that came from deep exhaustion and fragile joy. Aiko didn't laugh as easily. Her humour had dulled into something quieter, a kind of melancholy peace. But she listened, and sometimes she smiled. She had seen enough of humanity to know that laughter was not a betrayal of grief, but its only antidote. By then, her English had improved. She could understand simple sentences, enough to catch meaning even when she missed the words. When Raymond spoke to her now, their conversations had rhythm, small, hesitant exchanges that bridged the impossible. One day, while she was sweeping near the mess hall, he approached her with something hidden behind his back. "For you," he said, smiling as he revealed it. A small notebook, its pages slightly yellowed, the cover scuffed. "To write," he added, tapping it lightly. Aiko stared at it wide-eyed. She had not held a book of her own since the war began. "For me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He nodded. "For Aiko." She accepted it as if it was sacred. That night, under the dim light of a single lamp, she opened the first page and wrote just 2 words in Japanese. "Watashi wa ikite iru." I am alive. It was the first time she had dared to write it. Winter came gently to Texas, the trees lost their colour, and the wind carried dust instead of rain. The guards wore thicker uniforms now, and the women were given extra blankets, warm coats with faded army insignias stitched across the chest. The Americans called it surplus. To the women, it felt like mercy. The holiday season arrived with a kind of cautious festivity. On December 24th, the camp's officers decided to host a Christmas dinner, not just for the soldiers, but for the prisoners as well. It was Captain Roberts' idea, a man known for believing that kindness was the best propaganda. The Japanese women were invited to attend, under supervision. Many were nervous, unsure if this was a test or a genuine act of generosity. The mess hall glowed with candlelight that night. Tables were lined with trays of food, unlike anything they had seen in years: roasted turkey, bread, potatoes, and something sweet that looked like cake. Music played softly from a radio, a woman's voice singing about snow and home. None of the prisoners understood the lyrics, but they felt the warmth of it all the same. Aiko sat beside Yumi, her hands trembling as she picked up a fork. Across the table, Raymond sat with a few other guards. When their eyes met, he raised his glass slightly, a silent toast. She smiled, a small, uncertain curve of the lips, and did the same with her cup of water. When the meal ended, something unexpected happened. One of the American soldiers brought out a guitar and began to play. The tune was lively but soft. Another began to clap, and soon a few guards started dancing, awkwardly, joyfully. The women watched, half amused, half bewildered. Then, to everyone's surprise, one of the nurses, the same woman who had once shared a song across the fence, approached their table and extended her hand toward Yumi. "Dance?" she asked gently. Yumi froze. "Dance?" she repeated, unsure. The nurse nodded encouragingly. The guards laughed, clapping their hands. Yumi hesitated only a moment before standing. The room erupted in gentle applause. The two women danced, one American, one Japanese, moving carefully, shyly at first, then freely, laughing as they stumbled over each other's steps. Aiko felt something tighten in her throat. The laughter, the music, the clapping, it all felt unreal. For a moment it was as if the war had never happened. Raymond noticed her expression and walked over. He didn't speak. He just extended his hand, the same gesture the nurse had made. "Dance?" he asked. She shook her head quickly, her face flushing. "No," she whispered. "I can't." He smiled softly. "Then just stand," and so she did. She stood beside him as the music played, not dancing, not moving, just existing, together. The warmth of the room wrapped around them like a memory. That night, when she returned to the barracks, the others teased her endlessly. "He likes you," Fumi said, grinning. "He looks at you like a poet." Aiko rolled her eyes, but her smile betrayed her. "He's just kind," she said. But even as she said it, she knew it wasn't the whole truth. As weeks passed, the line between captor and captive blurred even further. Conversations grew longer. Smiles lingered. Small acts of humanity became routine. A shared meal, a traded word, a quiet laugh. And yet, in the back of everyone's minds, there lingered the unspoken truth. It couldn't last. By early February, orders arrived from Washington. The camp would soon begin transferring prisoners. Some would be repatriated to Japan. Others, mostly those deemed low risk, would be sent to different facilities for re-education. When the announcement was made, a heavy silence settled over the women. For many, the idea of returning to Japan meant returning to ruins. For others, it meant home. But a home that no longer existed. Aiko sat on the edge of her bunk that night, staring at the notebook Raymond had given her. She turned to a blank page and wrote a single question. "Where is home?" Then she closed it, unable to answer. The next morning she found Raymond near the supply tent. He looked uneasy. "You heard?" he asked softly. She nodded. "Japan?" she said, her voice barely audible. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair. "I don't want you to go," he said before he could stop himself. The words hung between them, dangerous and sincere. She looked at him, her heart pounding. "War finished," she said slowly. "You free, Not free," he shook his head. "You are more free than you know." She didn't understand what he meant. Maybe he didn't either. They stood there, two people bound by circumstance, staring at each other as if time might freeze out of pity. Days turned into weeks, and departure day approached. The camp, once lively with small joys, grew sombre. The women packed the few belongings they had been allowed: letters, trinkets, folded blankets. Some cried. Others simply stared into the distance. Aiko didn't cry. She couldn't. On the morning of February 21st, the trucks arrived. The sky was pale, streaked with thin clouds. The women lined up, their coats buttoned, their hair neatly tied. The guards stood nearby, some saluting quietly, others avoiding eye contact altogether. Raymond was among them. When Aiko's name was called, she stepped forward. He watched her walk past, every movement burned into his memory. When she reached the gate, she stopped and turned. Their eyes met across the distance. He raised a hand. She did the same. No words were spoken. There was nothing left to say. The truck rumbled to life, and the camp slowly receded into dust and horizon. For hours, Aiko sat in silence, the notebook clutched in her lap. She opened it once, staring at the words she had written weeks before. I am alive. The letters blurred through her tears. The journey back to Japan was long and hollow. The ship smelled of fuel and salt, of exhaustion and loss. When they finally reached Yokohama, the sight that awaited them was devastation, a city burned to its bones. Buildings reduced to skeletons of ash, streets filled with silence. Children wandering barefoot, eyes too old for their faces. Aiko felt something inside her collapse. The homeland she had dreamed of was gone. The propaganda, the pride, the glory, all of it had turned to dust. But amid the rubble, life persisted. She found work at a small clinic helping displaced civilians. Her hands, once used to treat soldiers, now tended to orphans and the starving. And though the pain was constant, she carried within her a strange calm, the memory of a place where kindness had survived war. Years passed. The world rebuilt itself in uneven ways. Aiko married a teacher, a quiet man who shared her hunger for peace. They moved to a small coastal town, where she tended a garden and taught children how to read. She never spoke much of the war, but sometimes, when she looked at the sea, she thought of Texas, of tall men and bright skies and laughter that had sounded like forgiveness. In 1970, she received a letter written in careful Japanese. It was from Raymond. He had found her address through a veterans organization. The letter was short, simple. Aiko, I hope you are well. I wanted you to know that I kept the little paper crane. It sits on my desk. Sometimes I look at it when the world feels heavy. It reminds me of kindness, yours and what it meant. I hope life has been gentle with you. I hope you still write. Raymond, she read it twice, then a third time, tears sliding down her cheeks. After so many years, she hadn't expected him to remember. But he had. That night she opened her old notebook and turned to a blank page. Her handwriting had changed with age, but her words flowed easily. I remember the laughter. I remember the sun. I remember that everything about them, their kindness, their forgiveness, their humanity, was larger than what I had been taught to believe. She closed the notebook gently and looked out toward the sea. The waves shimmered in the moonlight, endless and patient. Somewhere, across that same ocean, she imagined Raymond sitting at his desk, the little paper crane beside him. In that quiet connection, stretched across decades and continents, the war finally ended for both of them. Because in the end, what survived was not victory or defeat, but the fragile, enduring truth that even in war, compassion can be larger than hate, and sometimes all it takes to remember that is a single act of kindness from someone who was supposed to be your enemy.